Welcome back, my loves, to the Boss Bitch Rising podcast. I am very excited to welcome Jamie Skaar here in today's episode. We're going to be having some powerful conversations around healing from trauma and getting into relationships and how to navigate the relationship dynamic. But me and Jamie actually met a couple months back in November of 2021 at an event that we spoke at together. And he just shared some very powerful points about relationships and healing. And he got really vulnerable with us and shared some of his truths and pains and how he's healed from it and how he's still navigating the world through those different traumas and triggers. And I wanted to bring him here today to really discuss all of that more in depth and hopefully enlighten you on how you can go deeper within your healing and find that safe space to be vulnerable, especially in relationships. So Jamie, thank you so much for being here with us today. If you would like to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Hi, I'm Jamie Skaar, and just incredibly excited to be here. As was pointed out, we got a chance to connect in November at a speaking engagement, and you're right. It was just such a great environment to be able to share about our personal experience and lessons that we've gained as we've gone through not only just our own lives, but also professionally. And I think that just opened up the door for us to be able to continue that conversation today. And I'm really excited to dive in and be able to talk about really relationships and emotional impact and, some of these things that we don't always get a chance to talk about in the open. And so I'm really excited to be able to do that here today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. So, as we move into the month of February, that's like seen as the month of love. And I really wanted to kind of go into different relational dynamics, and relationships really rule all of our lives in different capacities, right? We first start by having that relationship with ourselves, and then we go into having the more closer relationships, whether they're friends, family, or intimate relationships. Then we have associates, acquaintances, working relationships or business relationships, and then the relationship we have with our community and the world. And it just has that ripple effect out. But I wholly believe that every relationship that we manifest into our life first starts with the relationship that we have with ourselves. And so it's really important, especially when we're having certain patterns or dynamics play out that are uncomfortable or even unwanted, instead of placing the responsibility on the other party completely, right? We need to also take a look at ourselves. In any relationship, there's two parties that are playing together. And so, of course, there's two different things that you need to take a look at, both yourself and another individual's participation. But I think it's really important that with any relationships that we have, starting with ourselves and taking a deeper look at how can we become the best version of ourselves. And really that starts with healing and connecting in through self-awareness. And I think that is just an important topic to discuss as we start to learn deeper aspects of who we are. What do you think is the start of pursuing that? Like, how does somebody go into that healing?
That's a great question. I think that the first thing that I start with is that, so you kind of mentioned having all these different relationships. In my opinion, and at least how I view it, is that the only relationship is the relationship with yourself. Every other opportunity is just an opportunity to see you reflected in that relationship. Right? So if you think about it, like anything that has ever happened in our life, all happened in our head, right? Like the world doesn't exist outside of anything that's ever happened in our mind, right? That's the only universe there is what's in your mind, right? And so to me, every day is about figuring out that relationship of who am I, where did I come from, where am I trying to go, how am I trying to manifest myself? And the interactions that we have with friends, with coworkers, with other people, that's really the opportunity to be able to discover and see ourselves, right? And so I always really take that into consideration when I'm going through the relationships. And that's great because it puts me in a position that really empowers me in all situations, right? Like nothing's ever the fault of the other party. It's why is this my reaction to that? And, kind of even going into what we're talking about here with traumas, like that's actually the most empowering thing that you could possibly do, because when it comes to having anything in our past that could be triggering to us, a lot of times those things happen at an unconscious level. And so I know for myself, I've found certain things in situations in relationships where like I might have this feeling like I need to get out of here. Like this relationship isn't gonna work, right? And if you were to ask me what was happening, I would say, oh, this person did that. So naturally I have to leave, right? But the reality is like, that's not what's really going on. Like, yeah, a person can do a thing, right? But why is this your reaction to that thing? Because you could have any type of reaction. Why is that your reaction? And so then once you kind of get to that space of, wait, why did I react that way? Now I can start asking deeper questions and trying to figure out, hey, wait, what is actually driving this or not driving this? That's something that I know for me has really opened the door up to being able to self-discover and self-realize a lot more.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful part of navigating through life in general is most of the time, especially if we're not coming from a self-aware space, we kind of like to put the blame on other people. We don't want it to be our responsibility, or even not to say our fault, but like maybe we did manifest this unknowingly into our life. And typically all of the things that are playing out in our life have a pattern to them in some way. And so if we really take a really bigger picture, if we pull back and look at the whole life, what are the patterns, and maybe where did this pattern even start? And sometimes it's, one incident that happened that really inset this trauma into our brain. Other times it's smaller, maybe more inconspicuous incidences that have played out and created that pattern, again, in a traumatic response, because it's kind of changing the way that we're seeing the world, seeing ourselves, and showing up in the world and for ourselves. And, a part of the healing process, it always takes deeper levels of self-awareness. And that takes a lot of grace and patience in the process too, because sometimes we're going to ask questions and want the answer right away, and we won't get the answer for months or maybe even years, right? And especially if you've gone through, whether it's obvious trauma or if you have patterns in your life that are really uncomfortable, this is your calling to, okay, if this is uncomfortable and I'm noticing that I don't like this, I need to kind of pull back and really figure out why. And I think, sharing your truth and being honest about what you've gone through in your life is a really important part of that process. And I know for Jamie, he actually shared this openly, in a very open space, I would say, on public TV. Like, I mean, if you want to share about that part of your story, I think we would love to hear it.
Yeah, so we were talking about as far as sharing my story on television. Yeah, that was a wild experience to take a really personal moment in my life and to put it out there for everybody to hear and evaluate and take their own opinions on it. I think it's one of the most powerful things that I've ever done, though, in that it really allowed for me to claim my story in a way that empowered me. And I'll kind of take that into context too, where I actually had a conversation with my grandma after I got back from the show, and she was actually a little bit hurt that I had told that story that way. And her exact words to me were that she kind of wished that I hadn't bore my soul like that to someone that I was still in this process of getting to know. And I heard her, and I understand where she's coming from on that. I think that, anything as major as losing your daughter or having a mom that commits suicide, I think that there's a lot that needs to be processed with that. And I think that, that's always going to be an ongoing journey.
Could you give our listeners some context as to what you shared, in case they're not familiar with who you are and the show that you were on and what the truth that you spoke?
Yeah, so I was on the Bachelorette, and the Bachelorette, her name is Michelle, and Michelle is a very family-oriented woman, and so like family and family dynamics were something that's really, really important to her. Her parents have been married for going on 40 years, right? And so that's something that she wanted to really recreate in her life. And for me, I'm listening to this and I'm hearing about someone talk about these things that really is far removed from what my reality and my experience growing up has been. Like I did not grow up in a traditional setting as far as like having both parents around. First, my mom had me when she was 18, right? So 18 years apart, my mom was as much my friend and someone that I was growing with in this world as she was my mom, right? But she had significant mental health issues. And that really led to a very long period throughout probably 12 to my mid 20s, where she had attempted to take her life multiple times. And that had put me in this position where it was almost like you couldn't really go to school because, hey, going to school, you know, this person might hurt themselves while you're not there. And that led to me missing months and months of school, to the point where I almost wasn't even allowed to go on to graduate. And I think that just kind of really changed a lot of things in relationship wise, because at that time too, with mental health, a lot of how those issues were solved were with different combinations of medications. And so, you know, a lot of it was really just getting someone a high enough dosage of medication to where you didn't have to worry about them doing anything damaging to themselves when you weren't there, but really you're actually kind of taking this person's ability to actually live autonomously in the world, you're taking that away, right? And so, you know, those things just had a huge impact. And it got to a point too where you can't continue to miss months of school and, you know, still carry on in the school system. So at a certain point, I did have to go back to school. And those used to be really, really stressful moments. I mean, I remember I'd be sitting in classes wondering like, wow, I wonder if right now is the moment where my mom's taking her life, or getting off the bus and coming back home and having to mentally prepare yourself for what it is that you might find, which is kind of crazy when I go back and think about this, that I like literally had to, in my mind, prep myself for what I might find. So like, it's interesting because it's like, you know, before my mom ever died, I actually saw her die 1,000 times in my mind, right? Which I'm sure it's got to have some kind of impacts at some point, right? And you can think about just like the transition on that relationship too, to where it's like you carry all this stress every day. Like I remember sometimes I'd be at school laughing and having fun, and then feeling guilty about the fact that I'm laughing and having fun, knowing that that's what my life looks like when I go back home. And then to go home and then it's like, oh, this person's just sleeping soundly and peacefully in their bed. You know, I think it just does a lot to, you know, just kind of your own psychology and upbringing at that point. And for me, like the biggest impacts have really come with not only losing my mom, but before my mom passed away, my aunt actually passed away at 16 after a heart surgery. My mom, she committed suicide when I was 24, and my aunt passing away had a huge, huge part to do with that. They had a very, very, very close relationship. Like, I don't think either one of them could have been in this life without the other. You know, they were really yin and yang of each other. My aunt had just this loud, boisterous, tons of energy, always made her presence known. My mom was much more quiet and reserved, but just engaging and magnetic, right? And I almost feel like how their energies worked, it's almost like my aunt cleared space, and then when my mom came in, like she just had that magnetic energy that brought all the people back in to fill that space. And so I know that for my mom, losing her sister was just not something that I think that she was prepared to continue on this life without. And so, yeah, that really transitioned. 24 is when she ended up taking her life. But then like shortly after that, like my other grandma passed away, and that was really, really unexpected. Like I literally had to hop on a flight to DC without my luggage, like literally just hop on with the clothes I had, like that kind of last minute. And then shortly after that, my other aunt passed away completely unexpectedly. And, you know, now I've kind of looked at this with my relationships through the years, and I'm now 33. And, you know, anytime I talk to my grandma, she's like, hey, where's that girlfriend and that marriage and, you know, my grandkids and da 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 da, right? And it's interesting because I've started to really look at some of the patterns in my relationships. And, you know, for me, I've never really looked at my childhood as being traumatic. It was just challenging. It was just my childhood, right? It's not until you really get out in the world and you start talking about, hey, here's how my life was, and then, oh, hey, here's how yours, and then people are like, what? You know, but you start to, oh, maybe there were some differences there, right? But I think one of the most powerful things that I've learned is going back and looking at the messages and the things that we tell ourselves when we went through those events. So one of the biggest things for me when my mom committed suicide is that I basically started running, and I ran for so long that I actually forgot that I was running. And I think it took about 5 years before I actually really realized it. Actually, even longer than that. It took 7. And it actually happened. I had a woman tell me that she loved me. And like 24 hours later, first I was like, oh, this feels great. And then like 24 hours later, the next day, I had an anxiety attack. Like I was literally stuck in my condo. I was in my beanbag. So I'd like, and I couldn't get out all day. And I'm like, what is going on? I don't think you're supposed to have this reaction when someone says that they love you. But in my mind, what was going on is that I started thinking of all of these women that I've had love for, said I love, and then I lost without like any kind of warning or any kind of expectation. So it was like, yo, remember when you told, and so Gail, going back to that as well, when I talk about these women that I've had that have passed away, it's not just that they passed away, it was kind of the context of it. So like my aunt, for instance, when she passed away when I was 16, we didn't have a close relationship growing up. She had lived with us a year before she went to go have heart surgery. We got close in that year and then she passed away. My mom and I didn't necessarily have like the closest relationship because of all the medications. So as a matter of fact, I was one of the last person to see my mom alive before she went missing. And so I remember when I was talking to her, I was like, wow, this is one of the most like coherent conversations I've been able to have with you in years, you know? And then the next day she was gone and I never saw her again. My grandma that passed away, the one on the East Coast, we were not close at all growing up. We had just gotten tight within the last several years. My sister and I actually finally felt like we met somebody from that side of our family. And it was like, yo, we can see where we came from. And then she passed away. And then my aunt, same thing. And so I realized from there that I had actually programmed in my mind that, oh, when you drop your guard with a woman, that's when you lose her. And so all of a sudden I'm realizing I'm sitting here and I'm having all this issue and I'm like, what is happening? And I'm like, I'm running through, you lost that one, right when you dropped your guard, right when you got close, right when you got close. And it made me realize, yo, I'm playing that out in my relationships. That moment that I get too close to somebody, all of a sudden now I'm just emotionally shutting down. Why? Not even consciously. Like I'm not shutting down because of this person. I'm not shutting down because of this relationship or because of the situation. It is literally because my body and mind have gone through these past experiences and then they wrote this thought or belief in to try to keep me safe from that thing from happening again. And now here I am bringing basically my past into the present. And even more damaging than that, actually projecting my past into my future with these relationships, not realizing that. And what ended up being the turning point while I was stuck there is that all of a sudden after, I mean, in hours, I'm sitting here just burning myself out going through this. See, you lost. And then all of a sudden I had a voice that came in and it said, this relationship's not that relationship. This woman's not that woman. This situation's not that situation. As a matter of fact, you're not even the same Jamie that went through that. And once I repeated that over and over and over again, it really put me into this space of like, wait a second, get out of this cycle from your past. You're actually not protecting yourself. You're actually really doing more damage to yourself. Why? Because you're pushing people away that genuinely care about you and want to be there for you. And once I realized that, I can't tell you how many relationships I've had with women who sat there are like, hey, I have feelings for you. And I, for whatever reason, had this internal feeling. We were talking about intuition. My internal feeling is just saying, no, I got to get out of here. I got to go. I can't be here anymore. Right. And I'm glad that those are things that I'm starting to realize and have awareness of now. But, you know, I definitely look back on a lot of relationships that were broken and were lost. That probably didn't need to be if I would have been able to address that sooner.
I would definitely say that like it's admirable for you to own your truth, right? And own it, especially in such a public space as you did. That can feel so scary. And for you to be able to do that and just like grounded in the truth, but to also have the self-awareness of maybe not noticing the pattern in the very beginning, but the more times a pattern plays out, it has to become obvious eventually. So I want to ask, how did you start to break that cycle? What were some of the things that you had to do once you were aware of those patterns and cycles in your relationships? What did you do for yourself to break out of that? Or what are you still doing?
I mean, I think the first one is being able to identify and put words to it, right? Because at the end of the day, everything is really just a narrative. So what's the story that we're telling, right? And so sometimes we have to give ourselves the space to listen to the words that we're saying, right? You know, sometimes it's like we're over talking ourselves. We have programming that we already have here that's running in the background, but now we're talking something else in the exact same space, and we're not hearing the old programming that we had going on. I will say that one of the biggest things, so I will say it's an ongoing journey. Like I don't believe that we heal from pains. I believe that we learn to walk with our pains, and that the fortunate few of us will be able to pull lessons from our pains that empower us for our journey ahead. Mm-hmm. And when I started thinking about it from that standpoint, because there might be some level of awareness that I get, and then if I try to act like that's the end of the journey and that's just the one piece, then all of a sudden, like I miss these other parts that are actually still associated and attached with that, right? So as an example, here's one of the things that I actually found out about myself that was very, very eye-opening. So even in context of actually the show, I actually learned this from going on the show. And that was one of the things that I had felt really confident about as far as participating was that I have spent the last 2 years like really, really diving in on like my emotional intelligence, right? And trying to figure out, you know, my feelings and where they're coming from. And so I felt like going into that environment, I was like, this is a great opportunity because I don't think I'm going to be in a space to where I can get triggered as far as being mad or sad or anything else. Like emotionally, I know that I'm in a really, really good spot to where I feel like it's a good opportunity for me to try and be in a relationship and be open and you know, be transparent. And what I hadn't taken into consideration is that trauma triggers are not the same thing as having an emotional reaction. And actually, it's completely different because when you're triggered from something that's happened in your past, such as, hey, when you let your guard down with a woman is when you lose them, right? And then now that happens, okay, the trigger there is not something that you're necessarily going to get mad or upset about. It's actually different. It's a shutdown, right? Because when we go through something that is extremely stressful, emotions go away. And so meanwhile, here I am thinking that I've got.
Preface that with the fight or flight response. I talk about this quite a bit. So when your emotions go away, now you're acting out of like more of an instinctual, animalistic kind of behavioral fight or flight response, which is something that most people don't have very much control over, very little control. So I just wanted to like put that in there.
That's exactly that. It is exactly that. Like all of a sudden, like the thought process behind things is completely different. So like I'm in the situation now where I'm like, I'm over this, I'm done. I don't want to be here anymore. Right. And when I ultimately ended up leaving, I remember I was in the limo on my way back home and I was like, damn, my heart hurts. It's like, why? And I was like, well, in my mind, I'm like, well, you wanted to leave, you're leaving. All right. Now, how do you feel about that? And it's like, well, what was the reason that you wanted to leave? Were you upset with the girl? And I was like, no. Were you upset with the guys? No. Were you upset with the production staff? And no, they treated me really well. Did you not like the situation? You know, some of that's a little bit debatable. But then I realized that the place that I was acting from really had nothing to do with them. It really had to do with me and this programming that I have that says that, hey, when you let your guard down, is when you lose people. And then looking back and feeling stupid myself, like, wait, why are you doing this? Why are you dropping your guard like this, right? And I think that's so powerful and so important to know, because at that point, what I looked at and I said, well, wait a second, my reactions right now have nothing to do with anything that's going on in my present. I am literally just reacting from this place in my past. And I'm bringing the past into my present. And now I'm making all these people around me pay for it when it's not their responsibility to be there for the hurts and the pains that I haven't actually resolved yet. And so I think that was just like a really, really huge moment for me to be able to understand that. Because before, you know, again, if you're looking for the problem in the emotions, but at the same time, the trauma trigger is the absence of emotion, then I wasn't even looking at the right place for the awareness to be able to properly respond. And being able to go through that and like break that down, now I know what that feeling is, right? And so now if I have this overwhelming drive of like, I need to get out of here, I need to leave, I can sit back and look at that and say, well, wait, let's break this down. Is it the person? Is it the situation? right? All right, is it any of those things? Is it something grounded right now in the present, or is it something that is a fear for the future, or something grounded from something that happened in the past? And I can now start to work with myself to start to figure those things out. So I think it's really helped a lot in improving my relationship with myself.
Absolutely. Do you feel like after you shared your truth with Michelle, do you think because of sharing your truth, then that kind of started to play out this like maybe back of your mind fear-based response where you're like, all right, shit's getting real. I think I need to get out of here. Or do you think maybe they're unrelated?
I think definitely. I mean, like the proximity of it. Well, it was interesting because for me, I was like, at that time, it didn't. It was weird. I felt like it was weird that I was even having a reaction to it in the way that I was. And then, kind of looking back, I'm like, honestly, the proximity of just having broken down and told somebody like the hardest things that you've ever gone through in your entire life. And then it's like, wait a second, like maybe you did that too soon, right? Or maybe that wasn't necessarily the best point to be able to do that. And so, yeah, I definitely do think that it played a part, right? Everything that we do and don't do always plays an impact on every part of the relationship, right? The things that we choose to say and the things that we choose to withhold. I think that for me, what makes that a valuable moment in time is, for as scary as it was to put out there, I do remember at the same time, there was like this sense of relief of like, whoa, I've been holding on to this. Like, here's a huge part of my life that I don't talk about with anybody. Not even because like I'm afraid to talk about it or I don't like to talk about it. Yeah, I would love more opportunities to be able to talk about my mom, right? That's every time we talk about somebody and a memory that we have of somebody, we bring them back to life. Every time we tell another person about that memory, we've now just passed their life on to somebody else. And so I would love to have those opportunities, but it's something that I've always withheld from because in my mind, it makes other people uncomfortable. And so I don't want to make you uncomfortable. And, that even goes back to the conversation I said that I had with my grandma, where she said that, she kind of wished that I hadn't put that out there like that. And, like I told her, yeah, I understand where that comes from. And, I'm sorry to have put you in that position. On the other side, though, what you haven't seen are the thousands of messages and DMs that I've gotten from individuals who have either gone through things like this or are going through things like this. I mean, I got messages like I had one person said that someone in their family that week had just committed suicide, and that my words gave them a way to move through that. I had people that were telling me that like that gave them the strength to continue on the next day. And so I think that was another huge moment to where I realized that it's so important to share our story. It's so important to share these lessons, right? Because you never know how a piece or part of your story might resonate with somebody else or might give them a key that they didn't have to open up a door that they've been stuck behind. And at the same time, not only can you free somebody else from a room they might be trapped in, but you also really can free yourself. I think about how much emotional space just got opened up by the fact that this thing that had all of a sudden become a secret in my life is now not a secret.
Yeah, that really makes me think about something that I talk about it pretty openly now, but I was running from my sexual assault when I was 13 years old for 15 years. It was a secret in my life. And I was very ashamed of it. For a long time, I felt like it was partially or mostly my fault. And I started, to share it with relationships. And I was like, oh, that was scary, not the right time, wrong person to share it with. And so then it would kind of make me stuff it down even more. But at a certain point, a couple years back, actually, I was just ready to just share my truth. But my parents were the last people that needed to know. And I wanted to start sharing it more on social media, on my podcast, on YouTube. And I couldn't not tell them because I have other family members that support me and listen to everything that I do. And I didn't want it to get back to them by way of somebody else and then them think that that family member is either lying or I'm lying about it. So I was like, I need to be totally transparent. And that was probably one of the most scary things I've ever done because of lots of different dynamics of how certain family members think of what I've gone through in their own frame of thinking. But when I finally shared my truth, it was emotional for me. I was crying, I was scared, I was shaking. But I knew that that was the right thing that I needed to do. And I got a lot of negative backlash, specifically from my father about, well, you're clearly not ready to share this. Look at you, you're a mess right now. And just not being sympathetic or supportive at all. And almost like the weight of what I shared with him didn't matter. It was how I was reacting as I was sharing my truth with him was what mattered most to him. But it was, scary in that space, and I still didn't have their support, but I didn't need their blessing, right? It would have just been nice to have their support, and I felt like I needed to share my truth. But finally, when I was able to fully open up, I actually recorded a whole podcast episode about healing after sexual assault and what that looks like and how long of a journey that was for me and the things that I needed to do for myself and then for the people around me, because that trauma was actually manifesting itself in so many different ways in every relationship that I had with everybody, because it was the relationship that I had with myself, and it changed the way that I saw myself. Just like you said, I had so many people reach out to me like, thank you for sharing your truth. Thank you for sharing this episode. And although sharing your truth is one of the most vulnerable things and scariest things you could possibly do in your life, you never know how many doors of just a deeper understanding that's going to open for somebody else to have, not only with themselves, but to feel like they're not so alone in what they're going through. But I would definitely encourage you, if there's something that you're considering just speaking your truth on, there's two and probably a lot more things that you definitely need. And first, it would be self-awareness. Are you actually ready to share this yet? And you're going to keep telling yourself no. But at a certain point, you just have to go past that fear and start speaking your truth. Maybe start in those safer spaces, and then maybe get a little bit more risky and start sharing it when you don't feel yet ready, but it's the right thing to do. But then also having the emotional regulation and knowing how to regulate your emotions, because you're probably going to get emotional still about it. And that's the other part of all of this, is when we go through those traumatic experiences or have things in our life that just have weighed heavily on us for years, decades even, it's okay to still be emotional. It's okay to still be essentially triggered with an emotion, right? Like to have an emotion come up. We're human beings. We have over 130 different emotions we can experience. So it's natural for us to still feel the pain, but it's how are we moving through that feeling in a positive way without sabotaging relationships or self-destructing on ourselves. And, I think those are two big things to consider when you are considering sharing your truth and then walking into that very sometimes scary, vulnerable place of actually being wholly who you are in your experiences.
I agree completely. I would even add on to that. I think that one part of it actually has to do with practice, right? Like sometimes we don't want to tell the story. And so we've never told the story. And so then when we go to tell the story, it's almost like how you're explaining to telling your parents, like, your dad's like, you're not telling this very well. It's like, well, I haven't put myself in very many opportunities to tell this story. So I'm actually brand new at it, right? And I even talk about that a lot in my relationships where, because I had this different upbringing without really having your father around and all these things, like my concept on relationships is way different. Like I didn't see the parents married and all of that. Like it was nothing like that. And so a lot of times I have to express and explain that, hey, I'm actually learning about relationships in real time with you. I know you would assume that I might know these things, but actually it's not something that's fundamental to me. And so I think that one, just acknowledging that it's a learning experience, right? Like all relationships are, and like, again, when every relationship is an extension of the relationship that we have with ourselves, like part of what we're talking about right now is how do we build that relationship and connection with ourselves stronger? The other thing that I really look at too is, when I talk about having gone through pains or suffering, one of my favorite books is A Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, right? And, he talks about obviously his experience of going through internment camps and, some of the worst conditions that you could ever possibly imagine, right? And one thing that I've always taken from that book is that it's not our pains and our sufferings that hold us back. It's not having pulled meaning from our pains and our sufferings that holds us back. And so for me, I always go back to whatever I feel like was the most hurtful or troubling thing that I've gone through and pull my meaning from it, right? You know, when I talk about my mom having passed, you know, would I've written that out in my story? Absolutely not. But let's look at the context of like things that have happened in my life since then. You know, for me, every time there's been a death, I've always taken that as life saying, you're not supposed to be here anymore. You need to move from here. You need to grow from here. And I look at now, like, what's my capacity for love when, you know, I don't have mom around and aunt around and grandparents and things like that. You know, now it's, well, I created my circle in my community with the relationships that I have, right? My cousins, for instance, you know, they lost their mom very young. So my aunt had 4 baby girls, and one of them, her name is Jamaica, and she ended up marrying the tribal son and for Quinault. And you know, losing your mom at such a young age, again, obviously that's never anything we would write into our own story. But one of the things that I always think about is that she is beloved in that community. And I think about the influence that she has as being a part of that community. And I'm like, you know, by virtue of this life event having happened, you're now in this position where you're influential to hundreds of people that see and know you in this community. You know, you wouldn't have had that if that hadn't happened. I always try to look at things and say, you know, not all of us are blessed enough to go through such hardships. It's not something that, you know, for me to tell the story, it's like a lot of people are like, whoa, wow, right? Why is that a whoa, wow? Because not a lot of people get the opportunity to go through that. And so at that point, when we do have these things that we go through that are hard, that are challenging, that are traumatic, what is the empowering belief or meaning that we can pull from that? And one, that's so important, because anytime anything in our life happens that's similar like that, it's going to trigger that thought. We're going to relive it. And if we haven't pulled a positive meaning, then every time we relive it, we lose something, right? But if you've done it, if you've done the work and you've pulled a meaning from there in a way that you can move forward with something, even though you may have lost, then now every time you replay it, you actually get something from that.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I have a lot of my clients do when they're still really holding on to situations. Is okay, you're still thinking about this, and every day this is something that you're carrying with you as a burden. But it's time that we start to unpack and remove that baggage off of you. And it's still going to be there. You know, you can still carry the bag, right? But it's not as full. And instead of having all of these really heavy negative thoughts and feelings associated with that event or that person, now we're going to start to implant new things. Be like, okay, what did I learn from it? How have I grown from it? In what ways is my life different in a positive way because of it? And I mean, you know, going back to my life experiences, I wholeheartedly believe that if I would have never gone through that, and then having kind of like the relationship that I do with my dad that I've had with my whole life, not being really the best one, those two situations being so predominant, I feel now I've had to I was like forced into my growth and healing because I was having so many really toxic relationship patterns continuously play out in my life. And now I've never had so many positive, amazing friendships and just connections in my life than ever before. But also I get to serve a huge community of specifically women, but just people in general that have gone through traumatic experiences that I would have never otherwise been able to serve because I wouldn't have had that life experience and feel exactly how they're feeling and know what it's like to carry that weight with you. And then also to see the patterns play out from those life events and those relationships that haven't really, you know, felt that great, right? So it's like showing gratitude, I think, is a huge piece where it's not like we're happy these things happened, right? That's not what we mean. Gratitude isn't necessarily happiness. It's just we're showing reverence to the things that have guided us forward in our life. And hopefully, if we, again, have the self-awareness enough, we're able to go deeply within the pain to discover all of these beautiful things that have now blossomed from it and grown from it.
I agree 100%. And, you know, kind of thinking about the things that have changed me from going through those events, you know, one of the things that made me even go back to it is that, you know, I just learned that if you're going to love if you're going to love who you are and who you're becoming, then you have to learn to love every part of your story that got you there.
Yes.
I needed all of it, right? And so, I mean, for me, there's a big part of needing to go back to all of those individual pieces and figuring out what, again, did I get out of this? And a lot of these things have drastically changed my life and who I am. And that's also one of the reasons why I realized it was so important for me to talk about. Like, hey, this is one of the biggest, these are some of the biggest things that contribute to the man that you see in front of you. And I'm not even talking to you about it. You know, when I look at, for instance, when my mom or my aunt passed away when I was 16, I remember that being this moment of like, we were going to the hospital. And yeah, it didn't look good. But in my mind, I was like, no matter what, it's going to be okay. Right. Because I've watched all these Disney movies. Like, I know how this ends. Yeah. Right. At the very end. Okay. Now she turns. And then all of a sudden she died. And I remember that just being like, whoa, all these stories that you have told me that I've watched, that's actually not real life. In real life, potentially any day is actually your last day, you know, and go through that. And then, you know, I lose my mom. And actually, it's interesting. So I have this bracelet right here. This is actually from Haiti. And I had gotten it for her. And so I saw my mom on the hospital. It was actually my birthday. And it had been this running joke. Again, she was on so many medications that every year my birthday would come around, she would forget. And then I might get like a message like 2 weeks or a month later. So I'm at the hospital and I'm there to say hi because it's my birthday. And, you know, she didn't remember. And it's interesting because I remember I was so stuck in my own hurt that I didn't have the capacity to be able to hold space for her hurt and really hear her. And it was interesting because I had this in my car and I was going to give it to her. And I decided, I said, I'm going to give you something to look forward to when you get out of here. And I'm going to give you this gift. Well, I never ended up seeing her again. And this has always been a reminder for me. Don't wait. If you have something that's well-intentioned and good in your heart, do it. Bring it to life now. And, you know, when I look at the manifesting of my life and how things have unfolded, you know, I've done some wild things in my life, from, you know, crazy last minute flights, starting companies, you know, things that, you know, would typically invoke a lot of fear in people. And, you know, I've had a lot of people that tell me like, Jamie, you live your life like this is your last day on earth. And the reality is that I actually do, like, because I very much so am in tune with the fact that it could be. I remember I was dating this woman and she lost her grandma. And I think she was like 33, 34, not her grandma, but she was. And I remember afterwards, she was saying that this was the first time in her life that she had really thought about death. And I was like, that's really interesting because I actually think about death almost every day. Like, not in some like impending kind of a way, but honestly with recognition and respect for the fact that that is actually a part of the circle of life, and that there will be a moment one of these days where, you know, I have to walk up and confront and have that conversation with death, and we have to move forward from there. And I always think about that as far as, hey, that's where this journey is ultimately going. What do we want to do right now, today, with the time that we have, with the energy that we have, with the opportunities that we have? How do you want to manifest that? How do you want to take control of that? How do you want to influence that? And I find that those things always just help a lot in grounding, and it helps a lot in clarity, you know? And so at that point too, when you start to realize that you have those things, like that's going to happen, going back and actually looking at some of these significant moments in our life, you're actually propelled to do that. I want to understand that better. Like, I don't want to destroy a whole bunch of relationships, understanding that I only have finite time. I want to maximize every relationship that I have and every day that I have. And so I think that those things really feed into each other.
Absolutely. Yeah. Death is just the inevitable part of life. That's the one thing that we are guaranteed when we come into this world. That's the one thing that we are guaranteed. Everything else is subjective to how we adapt, adjust, and behave along the way. And I think that is part of our personal responsibility, each of us as human beings, regardless of what your level of trauma is. And I'm a believer that we all have our own different magnitudes of trauma. Some of them are very obvious and very intense and acute, and other people, it's like just they didn't realize, like how you mentioned earlier, what was really normal to you as you started to discuss this maybe as an adult or just as a kid, and you're like, wait, no one else has gone through this. Oh shit, maybe I am a little traumatized.
I could
And
actually tell you my sister. So like I told you, I had that incident. This woman tells me she loves me, and then I go through this crazy panic attack. I'm like, what is going on, right? And so like I felt such a way about it that I actually bought a flight like 3 days later to go up to Oakland to see my sister. And so I'm sitting with my sister, and I kind of tell her about this and tell her about this reaction that I have, and I'm like, and like for context too, like maybe a few years before that, my sister's talking about her upbringing, and she's like, yeah, it was so traumatic and da 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 da. But also, I didn't have a relationship with it like that, right? So at the same time, I was like, honestly, I kind of dislike the fact that you're referring to our childhood as traumatic. Like, was it a challenge? Yes, absolutely. But to just say traumatic, I was like, I don't know. And so like I went through this whole situation, and I'm like having this crazy reaction. And it actually caused me to look up the definition for trauma, which I had never done before. And so it turns out trauma is basically just when an event happens that's so significant that you can't process all of it in real time. And I was like, actually, I'm sitting there with my sister, and I was like, so yeah, I actually looked this up, and I think I might have to agree that our childhood might have been traumatic. And she looks at me and goes, are you fucking serious? Duh.